The train groaned into Hollow Bend, Wyoming territory, releasing steam that froze instantly in the late autumn air of 1888. The sound was a sigh of surrender. Mara Quinn felt it in her bones. She stepped down onto the hard-packed dirt of the platform, clutching the handle of her carpet bag. It was light, holding all she had left. The sky was a flat, bruised sheet of pewter, promising a winter that had no mercy. Wind, born on the high plains, tore down Main Street, lifting grit and alkali dust in sheets that stung her face and tasted of failure. Hollow Bend was not a town. It was a scar, a raw railhead clinging to the tracks, smelling of coal smoke, green lumber, and sour whiskey. Mara pulled her thin wool coat tighter. It was not made for this wind. In her pocket, her fingers brushed against two things, a crumpled letter and a hard, square receipt. The letter, promising steady work sewing at the Mercantile, was 6 weeks old. The receipt was from a pawn shop in Cheyenne, and it was for her wedding ring. She walked against the wind, her head down, toward the only two-story structure that looked like it rented rooms, the Drover's Rest. The lobby was dark, smelling of stale tobacco and boiled cabbage. A man sat behind the desk, reading a day-old Gazette. He was thick in the shoulders and soft in the middle, his waistcoat stained. He did not look up when she entered, only when her bag touched the floor. "A room," Mara said. Her voice was hoarse from the dust. The landlord, Mr. Grice, lowered the paper. His eyes traveled over her, slow and assessing. He took in the worn coat, the absence of a husband, the desperation she was trying to hide behind a straight spine. "A room is $1, in advance." "I have it," she said, though it was nearly the last she had. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the ledger. "A lone woman," he said, letting the words hang in the stale air. "It's bad for business. Causes talk. Men get ideas." Mara felt a cold sickness rise from her stomach. "I am a widow, sir. I am here for work. I won't be any trouble." "Oh, I'm sure you won't," Grice said. His smile was slow, showing a gold tooth. "But the trouble finds you, don't it? A woman alone. She needs protection. She needs an arrangement to keep things quiet." He tapped the ledger. The implication was as clear and as cold as the wind outside. He was not offering her a room. He was offering her a different kind of debt. Mara's hands clenched. She had faced this before. This casual cruelty that assumed her poverty and her gender made her public property. "I do not understand your meaning, sir." "I think you do," he said, his voice dropping to a greasy familiarity. "You think on it. I'll hold a room. Number 4, top of the stairs." She could not breathe the air in that room for one more second. I need an hour to collect myself." Grice shrugged, picking up his paper. "An hour. Don't take too long. Winter's coming." Mara turned and pushed her way back out into the wind, the door slamming shut behind her. The cold was a shock, but it was clean. She stood on the boardwalk, the dust scouring her cheeks, and fought the urge to weep. Tears were a luxury, and they froze. She had nowhere to go. She walked toward the depot, the only other place that might offer warmth without a price. The depot cafe was small, just a counter and 4 tables. It smelled of burnt coffee and fried bacon. Only one other customer sat in the gloom, at a table in the far corner. He was a stranger, broad-shouldered, wearing a battered coat that looked like it had seen hard winters. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow, but she could see the creases the sun had burned into the skin around his eyes. He was nursing a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. He looked like the land itself, worn down, quiet, and unforgiving. Mara went to the counter, her eyes on the fly-specked menu chalked on the wall. Coffee, 5 cents. Stew, 10 cents. She felt the weight of the coins in her pocket. She had just enough for the room, but not the room and food. She ordered nothing. She moved to the stove, pretending to warm her hands, trying to think, There was no one to wire, no one to ask. Her husband, Liam, had seen to that, dying in a mind blast that left nothing behind but his name on a stack of debts. From his corner, the man watched her. He did not stare, but his gaze was steady. He saw the way her coat gaped at the throat, the raw red of her chapped knuckles as she rubbed them together. He saw her glance at the menu, do the math in her head, and then turn away. Her pride a visible, brittle thing. He saw her count her coins twice, her thumb moving over them in her pocket, a small, secret motion. His name was Jack Ransom, but the few people he'd spoken to in Hallow Bend knew him only as Smith. He was not a drifter, but he was drifting, inspecting distant grazing leases under a plain name after a season of rustling and a blizzard that had cost him good men. He knew the look of someone cornered. Mara could not stand the scrutiny. The smell of the coffee was making her sick with hunger. She turned and left the cafe, stepping back onto the boardwalk. The decision made, she would face Grice again. She would take the room, lock the door, and pray he did not have a key. She had taken 2 steps when a voice, thick with liquor, cut through the wind. "Well now, looky here." A ranch hand, drunk before noon, stumbled out of the saloon next door. He was young, but his eyes were old and mean. He blocked her path, grinning. "A new dove in town," he slurred, reaching for her arm. Mara jerked back. "Leave me be." "Ah, don't be like that. A widow, ain't ya?" He looked her up and down. "Heard tell widows are for sale in Hallow Bend. What's your price, darling?" Mara looked past him, toward the Drover's Rest. In the window, she could see Grice. He was watching. His face was flat, amused. This was the trouble he'd warned her about, the trouble he was offering to protect her from. "Please," she said, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "Get out of my way!" "I'll get in your way," the drunk, Silas, promised, grabbing her carpet bag. "Let's see what you got." "That's enough, friend." The voice was quiet, deep, and held no trace of friendliness. The stranger from the cafe stood just behind the drunk. He hadn't made a sound. He was tall, taller than the ranch hand, and seemed to block out the pewter sky. Silas wheeled, his hand dropping toward the Colt on his hip. The stranger didn't move. He didn't reach for his own gun, holstered low and tied down. He just looked at the man. His eyes, now visible under the brim, were the color of cold steel. "Heard me," the stranger said. It was not a question. Silas's drunken bravado evaporated under that gaze. He saw something in the stranger's stillness that was more dangerous than any loud threat. He was a bully, and bullies only understood force. This man was force. "Just having fun," Silas muttered, letting go of the bag. "Your fun's over. Walk off," the stranger said, his voice dropping an octave. Silas hesitated, looked at Mara, then back at the stranger. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the boardwalk, just missing the stranger's boots. Town's full of her kind. He turned and stumbled back toward the saloon. Mara leaned against the clapboard wall, her knees weak. The carpet bag felt impossibly heavy. The stranger picked it up. "Ma'am," he held it out to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His hand was rough, calloused, but steady. "Thank you, sir." He nodded, turning to go. "Wait!" The word tore out of her. It was the sound of her last hope breaking. He stopped, turning back. She looked at the saloon, then at the watching window of the Drover's Rest where Grice had disappeared from view. She looked at the stranger. He had intervened. He had done it quietly. He had not drawn a weapon. He had not looked at her like the drunk, or like Grice. "Sir," she began, the words choking her. Desperation made her bold. I have a room at the boarding house, but the landlord, he—" Jack waited. He knew what the landlord wanted. "He won't rent to a lone woman. He thinks—" She swallowed her pride. It tasted like ash. "I need a husband. Just for tonight. Just to get the room." The request hung in the air between them. Stark and unbelievable. Jack Ransom looked at her for a long moment. He saw the panic in her eyes, but beneath it, the hard granite of survival. She was not asking for $1. She was not asking for an arrangement. She was asking for a shield. His eyes, which had been so cold, softened with a tired kind of mercy. He had seen the world grind good people down. He hated men like Grice. "Please," she whispered. I cannot pay you. But I swear, I mean only for the pretense, to sign the book. Nothing more." He considered the risk. He was here to be invisible, to find the men stealing his cattle. This would make him visible. But the sight of Grice's amused face in that window stuck in his craw. "He agrees," Mara rushed on. "If I have a husband, if you would just walk in with me. Say you are my husband." Jack gave a single, sharp nod. "On one condition, ma'am. Anything. We keep our hands, and we keep our dignity. Both of us." Relief hit Mara so hard she swayed. "Yes, of course. Thank you. My name is Mara Quinn." "John," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "John Quinn. Lead the way. Mrs. Quinn." The name felt strange on her tongue, but she held it like a weapon. She walked back into the drover's rest, the tall stranger at her side. Grice was behind the desk, a smirk on his face, ready for her answer. The smirk vanished when he saw the man behind her. "I'm here for the room," Mara said, her voice clear. "My husband and I. Room 4. Grice's eyes shot to Jack, taking in the height, the worn gun belt, the absolute lack of humor in his face. This was not a man to be trifled with. And he was not the man Grice had seen in the cafe. This man looked like he owned things. "Mr. Quinn," Jack said, his voice flat. He stepped forward, pulling the ledger toward him. Mara handed him the pen, their hands brushing again. He signed, his script quick and clean, Mr. and Mrs. John Quinn. Mara placed the $1 on the counter. Grice's hand was slow taking it. He pushed a key toward them. "Top of the stairs," he grumbled. "I know," Mara said. Jack picked up her carpetbag in one hand. As they turned toward the stairs, he placed his other hand lightly on the small of her back. It was not a caress. It was a signal. It was possession. It was for Grice. But the warmth of it burned through her thin coat, and Mara felt a flush rise up her neck. They passed the parlor. The weak fire in the grate did little against the chill, but 2 women sat nearby, knitting and talking in low voices. They stopped when they saw Mara and Jack. Their eyes took in the man, the woman, the single bag. They marked them as a couple, poor but proper, and immediately lost interest, returning to their gossip. The pretense had worked. They climbed the narrow stairs. The hallway was cold. Jack stopped at room 4 and waited for her to take the key. She unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was small, narrow, and cold. It held a single iron bedstead with a thin mattress, a rickety chair, a washstand with a pitcher, and a small stove that was cold as stone. The window looked out onto a bleak alley. The door clicked shut behind them, and the sound was deafening. The pretense was over. They were alone. Mara turned, her back to the door, wringing her hands. Thank you. I don't know how to—" Jack set her bag down by the bed. He moved to the stove, checking the flue and the kindling box. It was empty. He grunted, then took off his hat, hanging it on a peg by the door, without the hat. His face was starker, the lines deeper. "You take the bed, Mrs. Quinn," he said, turning to her. "No, I couldn't. You did this for me. I will take the chair." "I won't hear of it. I'm used to sleeping rougher than that chair." He looked at the thin blanket on the bed. "We'll need more wood. And another blanket if Grice has one." "He won't give it." He will, Jack said. He went to the door, opened it, and disappeared down the hall. Mara stood in the center of the room, her heart pounding. The wind sawed at the eaves, a high, lonely sound. The little stove ticked as it cooled. She was in a room, alone, with a man she did not know, who was pretending to be her husband. She should have been terrified. She was, but it was a different fear than the one Grice inspired. Jack returned moments later. He carried 3 split logs and a heavy, dark wool blanket. "Where did you get these?" "The hall closet." Grice was busy. He didn't elaborate. He knelt at the stove, arranging the kindling with practiced, efficient hands. He struck a match, and soon a small, hungry fire was crackling. He dropped the blanket on the chair. "That's for me," he said, answering her unasked question. "The rules stand. You take the bed, I take the chair. If anyone knocks, I answer as John Quinn." He sat in the chair, pulling it near the stove, but not too near. He kept his coat on. He did not look at her, giving her the courtesy of privacy. Mara slowly unpinned her hat. She took off her coat and laid it over the foot of the bed. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the ropes creaking. The room was warming, but the silence stretched. "He's a banker," Mara said into the dark. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the walls. Jack looked at her. "Ma'am?" "The man I owe, the one who, Liam, my husband, he left debts to a man named Clinton Vale. He's the banker here. He wrote me. He said if I came to Hallow Bend, he would forgive the debt for service." She said it flat, without emotion. She was tired of being ashamed. "The work at the mercantile was a lie, just to get me here." Jack stared into the small, glowing grate of the stove. "Vale." He said the name softly. "You know him?" "I know of him," Jack said. "He's buying up defaulted notes all over the territory. He aims to collect. He wants the last thing I have." She didn't have to say what it was. The quiet settled again, broken only by the wind and the fire. "You?" she asked, boldened by her own confession. "Why are you here, Mr. Quinn?" He almost smiled. It was just a brief easing of the lines around his mouth. "Call me John, and I'm just checking on some property. Had some trouble with cattle. And snow." He offered no more, but it was an exchange. She had told him of her mind blast. He had told him of his snow. Both were disasters. "Well," Mara said, pulling her feet up onto the bed. "Thank you, John, for the fire and for this. Get some sleep, Mrs. Quinn." She lay down, still in her dress, and pulled the quilt up to her chin. He sat in the chair, tilted back against the wall, his long legs stretched out. The fire ticked. The wind howled, a living thing trying to get in. Mara watched the stranger's silhouette. He was awake, watching the fire, his hands resting on his knees. He seemed patient, like a mountain waiting out a storm. She closed her eyes. She must have drifted off, because the sound that woke her was a sharp, hard knock on the door. Mara sat bolt upright, her heart in her throat. Jack was on his feet instantly, moving from the chair to the door in 2 silent strides. He hadn't been asleep. "Who is it?" His voice was low, steady, and held the unmistakable edge of a man woken from his sleep, annoyed. "It's Grice," the landlord's voice came through the wood. "Just checking the stove. Mrs. Quinn, making sure the flue is drawing. Don't want a fire." It was a lie. It was midnight. Jack cracked the door open 4 inches, blocking the opening with his body. Mara could see Grice's oily hair in the lamplight from the hall. "The stove is fine," Jack said. His voice was gravel. Grice tried to peer around him, to see the bed, to check for impropriety. He wanted to catch her alone. He wanted to find her vulnerable. Jack didn't move. He simply rested his open palm flat against the doorframe, just above Grice's head. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. It was a gesture that said, "This threshold is mine. This room is mine. She is mine." Grice looked at the broad, calloused hand, then at the cold eyes of the man filling the doorway. He saw the chair with the blanket draped over it. He saw the bed, where Mara was sitting up, watching. He saw a husband. "Fine," Grice grunted, taking a step back. "Just checking." "Good night," Jack said, and he shut the door. Sliding the small bolt across, the lock clicked into place, a sound of finality. He turned back to the room. He nodded once to Mara, then went back to the chair, settling in for the rest of the night. Mara lay back down. She heard the wind sawing at the eaves, and the stove ticking, and the quiet, steady breathing of the stranger in the chair. The fear, the cold, the knot of panic in her belly, finally uncoiled. She was not safe, she was not home, but for the first time in months, she was not alone. Mara Quinn finally slept. Mara woke to the feeling of cold pressing in from all sides. The fire in the small stove had died to gray ash, and the single window was opaque with frost. She was stiff, still in her dress, the quilt pulled to her ears. Across the room, Jack was already on his feet, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. He had not slept well in the chair, but he had slept, a low-brimmed hat doing the work of a pillow against the wall. He put the hat on, his movements economical, and nodded a good morning. "Frost is thick," he said. His voice was rough from the cold. Morning light, thin and blue, cut through the ice on the glass. Outside, Hallow Bend was rimed in white. Every hitch rail, every splintered boardwalk, every nailhead glittered with a fierce, cold beauty. "I need to find work," Mara said, sitting up. The words came out in a cloud of steam. "I cannot pay for this room another night." "Grice won't trouble you, long as he thinks I'm here. But I have to eat, and I have to pay you. You owe me nothing. Mrs. Quinn," he said, the name still feeling strange. "But work is a good idea, keeps the mind steady." He rebuilt the fire while she used the washstand, breaking a film of ice in the pitcher to splash her face. The water was a shock, but it woke her fully. She combed her hair with her fingers and pinned it back, her face set. They left the room together, another performance for Grice, who watched them from the lobby desk with sour eyes. Jack walked with her, not beside her, but a half step ahead, as if leading the way. "The laundry," he said, pointing. "Mrs. Gable. She's hard, but she's fair. Sometimes needs an extra hand when the railroad crews are in." The laundry was a long shed behind the mercantile, billowing steam into the frozen air. It smelled of lye, scorched cotton, and human sweat. Mrs. Gable was a raw-boned woman with arms like cordwood, her face permanently flushed from the heat. She looked Mara up and down. "You?" "I can work hard," Mara said. "We'll see. 10 cents an hour. Through sundown, you'll scrub, wring, and fold." Jack nodded to Mara. "I'll be back by dark." He turned and walked away, his long strides eating up the dusty street. Mara was given an apron and pointed to a copper tub filled with boiling water and railroad linens. The steam was blinding. It scalded her face, her arms, her knuckles, but she did not wince. She plunged her hands in with the wooden paddle, her mind fixed on the 10 cents an hour. She scrubbed until her shoulders ached. She wrung heavy canvas sheets until her wrists burned. The other women worked in silence, a grim sisterhood of steam and lye. By noon, her hands were bright red, the skin blistering. She hid them under the damp apron, clenching her teeth against the pain, and kept working. Jack, meanwhile, did not go far. He spent his morning at the livery stable, a place where men talked while they worked. He paid the hostler a quarter to grain his horse, a big roan that looked as tough as its owner. He leaned against a stall, whittling a piece of pine, seeming idle. "Lot of wind," he'd offered to the hostler, a man named Silas. "Always wind," Silas grunted, forking hay. Seems a hard winter for cattle, Jack said. Hard for some, profitable for others. Jack's knife stopped moving. How's that? Heard the Double Bar R lost a herd. Blizzard up north. Hundreds of head. Vanished. Is that so? You'd think they'd drift south. You'd think, Silas said, spitting. Funny thing, though, seems fresh-branded steers keep showing up in the pens down by the railhead. Wrong brands, too. Sloppy work. Rustlers, Jack said, his voice flat. Or just smart businessmen. Red Lanty, over at the saloon. He seems to know who's selling. And Banker Vale. He seems to know who's buying the notes on the ranches that go bust. And the line camps? Jack asked, his voice casual. Any vacant? A few. Double Bar R has a camp up on Coal Creek. Empty, last I heard. Too far out for most. Jack nodded, pocketing his knife. Obliged. He spent the rest of the afternoon walking the edge of town, his eyes scanning the brands on the ponies tied up outside the saloon, his mind mapping the connections. Lanty, Vale, and stolen cattle. Late in the afternoon, Mara collected her pay, 50 cents. Her hands were raw, the blisters broken. She clutched the coins tight, the metal biting into her damaged skin. She stopped at the dry goods counter in the mercantile, needing thread and a bar of soap. 2 women were at the counter, wives of men who mattered in the town. They were looking at bolts of wool, their gloved hands dismissing the fabric. They saw Mara approach. Their conversation did not stop, but their bodies shifted. They pinched their lips, their gaze flicking over Mara's coarse dress, the steam-dampened hair, the red, ruined hands. They shuffled half an inch away, as if her poverty might be catching. Mara kept her chin high and waited. When they had finished, the clerk, a young man with slicked back hair, turned to her. Thread, Mara said, her voice quiet. Black, and 1 bar of lye soap. He slapped the items on the counter. 8 cents. Mara knew it was high. She had priced soap yesterday. It should be 5. Price went up, the clerk said, bored. I only have... She stopped. She would not beg. She laid out the 8 cents. The clerk was about to hand her the items when a shadow fell over the counter. Man's wrong, Jack's voice said. The clerk looked up. Startled, Jack was standing right behind Mara. Price on the soap is 3 cents. Thread is 2. You're overcharging the lady by 3 cents. The clerk's face flushed. Sir, I don't know who you are. I'm her husband, Jack said. The words were quiet, but they landed like stones. The 2 ladies by the door stopped to listen. Give her back her 3 cents. The clerk, cowed by Jack's stillness, fumbled in the till and pushed 3 pennies across the counter. Mara snatched the coins and her parcels, her face burning. She walked out of the store, Jack following. She stopped on the boardwalk, the cold air hitting her hot cheeks. She rounded on him. Don't you ever do that again? Jack looked surprised. I was just... You shamed me. You made me look like I needed a man to fight my battles over 3 pennies. I can pay my own way. He was cheating you. I know he was cheating me. Everyone cheats me. I handle it. I don't need you to handle it. Her pride, sharp as ice, was all she had left. She was shaking. He saw it was not just anger. It was humiliation. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a few coins. Here, for your trouble. You earned more than 50 cents for that work. Mara looked at the silver in his calloused palm, and it felt like the biggest insult of all. It felt like Grice's arrangement. It felt like Clinton Vale's service. I will not take your money, she hissed. I am not your charity. Mr. Quinn, I am your partner in a lie. Nothing more. She turned and walked, almost running, back toward the Drover's Rest, leaving him standing on the boardwalk, the coin still in his outstretched hand. They kept up the marriage. It was the only way to survive. Grice kept his distance. The drunk, Silas, gave her a wide berth. But the pretense, born of desperation, began to change. It softened at the edges. They found they could eat cheaply in the boarding house's drafty back kitchen, sharing a table near the stove. They ate biscuits and thin stew, not speaking much, but the shared silence was a comfort. He would pass her the salt before she asked. She would refill his coffee mug from the pot. Small, unconscious gestures of care. In the evenings, they would sit in their small room. The wind howled. The stove ticked. They would swap news in low voices, a habit formed on that first night.
Mrs. Gable says I can have steady work if the crews stay,
Mara offered, rubbing tallow into her cracked hands. The hostler says the rustlers are using a camp on Coal Creek, Jack murmured, checking the action on his revolver. The lie was a small, shared shelter against the wind. Sometimes, when he was cleaning his tack and she was mending a tear in her dress, their eyes would meet. A little smile would pass between them, acknowledging the strangeness of it all. The warmth of a shared cup of coffee when the fire died down felt almost like intimacy. One afternoon, Mara saw a torn oilskin slicker thrown in a heap by the laundry. "What's that?" she asked Mrs. Gable. "Ruined. Belongs to a teamster. Seams split clean open. Can I have it?" Mrs. Gable shrugged. "It's trash." Mara took it back to her room that night, using the thread she'd bought and a heavy needle she borrowed. She sat by the fire and began to stitch. Her hands were sore, but she was a good seamstress. She didn't just mend the seam, she reinforced it, stitching a new canvas patch over the tear and sealing it with pine pitch Jack found for her. It was ugly, but it was strong. The next day, she found the teamster. He was overjoyed. "I thought it was done for." He pressed 2 dimes into her hand. 20 cents. It was a victory. It was the first glimmer of hope. That same day, Jack was at the livery when a freighter's wagon snapped its tongue, dumping a load of flour sacks into the dust. The owner was cursing, the wagon blocking the street. Jack watched for a moment, then walked over. "Got an auger?" he asked the liveryman. For the next 2 hours, Jack worked. He found a piece of cured oak, shaped it with a draw knife, bored the holes, and fitted it to the wagon. He worked without talking, his movements sure and strong. When he was done, the wagon was solid. The freighter, a man named Henderson, was grateful. "Sir, I owe you. Let me pay you for the time." "No pay," Jack said, wiping grease from his hands on a rag. "At least let me—" Henderson ran into the cafe and came back with a fresh, hot biscuit, wrapped in a napkin. Jack looked at the biscuit, then at the man. He nodded and took it. He and Mara met back in the room as dusk fell. She held up her 2 dimes, her face bright. "I stitched an apron." He held up the biscuit. "Repaired a wagon tongue." They looked at each other, at the 20 cents and the biscuit, and for the first time, in that cold, narrow room, they both laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, rusty from disuse, but it warmed the air better than the stove. The laughter died quickly. The next afternoon, Jack was cleaning his rifle when he looked up and saw 2 men standing in the street, watching the boarding house. One was stout, with a red florid face and a gaudy vest. The other was thin, dressed in black, a hired gun if Jack had ever seen one. Jack set the rifle down and went outside. He stood on the porch, his hands loose. The stout man walked over. "You're the new fella, Quinn." "Smith," Jack corrected him, using the name he'd given at the livery. "John Smith." "Heard Quinn, heard Smith, don't much care." The man said, "I'm Red Lanty. I own the saloon. I own most things in this town that are worth owning, and I like a quiet town." "Seems quiet enough," Jack said. "It is, long as folks mind their own business, and asking after other men's cattle. That ain't minding your own business. That's sticking your nose where it might get broke." The hired man on the street shifted, his hand resting on his gun butt. "I just make conversation," Jack said, his voice mild. "Make conversation about the weather," Lanty advised. "Some men get awful touchy about their livestock. Awful touchy about strangers asking questions at the livery. You and your wife, you'd be smart to ride on. This territory ain't healthy for nosy folk." Lanty smiled, a gold tooth glinting. He turned and walked back to his man, and the two of them disappeared into the saloon. Jack stood on the porch for a long time, the wind cold on his face. He was no longer just tracking thieves. He was now a target. That night, the weather turned. The pewter sky, which had threatened for days, finally broke. It didn't snow. It spat sleet. Mara was let go from the laundry early, the wind driving the icy pellets so hard it was impossible to see. She ran, head down, clutching her thin coat. A figure stepped out of the gloom. She cried out, thinking it was the drunk, Silas, or one of Lanty's men. "It's me," Jack's voice. He was waiting for her. He didn't say a word. He just opened his heavy coat, the one that had seen hard winters, and pulled her in against his side. He wrapped the coat around them both and tucked her head under his chin. "Walk," he said. They moved as one person through the blinding sleet. Mara could feel the solid wall of his chest, the warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart under her ear. He shielded her from the wind, taking the brunt of the ice on his back and hat. They burst into the boarding house, gasping, shaking with cold. Grice wasn't at the desk. They hurried up the stairs, dripping water. Inside the room, Jack bolted the door and stuffed a rag under it to block the draft. The sleet hammered against the window like tiny fists. "Get those wet things off," he ordered, his voice rough. He was already shucking his coat. His shirt underneath was soaked. Mara's dress was plastered to her, her hands so numb she couldn't work the buttons. He saw her fumbling, her fingers blue. He knelt by the stove and struck a match, his own hands shaking violently from the cold. The kindling was damp, but he nursed it, blowing gently until a blue flame flickered. He piled on wood. "Turn your back," he said. She did. She heard him stripping off his wet shirt. She heard the sound of water sluicing from it as he wrung it out. "Your turn. The dress. You'll freeze." She turned back. He was bare-chested, his back to her, wringing the shirt over the slop bucket. His skin was crisscrossed with old scars, white against the tan. He was solid muscle, built for work and hardship. She fumbled with her own buttons, her pride gone, replaced by a desperate need for warmth. She got the dress off, her hands shaking so badly she dropped it. She stood in her thin chemise and petticoat, shivering. "Here." He hadn't turned. He tossed her the heavy wool blanket from his chair. She wrapped it around herself, huddling over the stove. He turned, pulling his own dry blanket around his shoulders. They stood side by side, too cold to be ashamed. Their backs to the bed, they watched the fire, their breath coming in visible clouds. The room was small, lit only by the flickering blue light from the stove's grate. "Better?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. They sank down onto the floor, huddling on the small, worn rug, their backs against the bed frame. The warmth of the stove was a blessing, hitting their fronts while the cold of the room pressed at their backs. They sat in silence for a long time, the sleet rattling, the fire hissing. Mara looked at him. His face was profiled in the firelight, all hard angles and shadows. His hair was damp, falling over his forehead. His hands, which had been shaking from cold, were steady now, resting on his knees. "Your hands," he said, looking at hers. They were raw, clutched in her lap. He reached out, slowly, and took one. He cradled it in his own large, calloused palm, his thumb gently tracing the broken blisters. His touch was rough, but it was indescribably gentle. "Lie," she whispered, her voice thick. "This is too hard a life," he murmured. his eyes on her hand. He looked up, and his gaze met hers. The air in the room changed. The sound of the sleet faded. There was only the firelight and the small space between them, and the warmth of his hand on hers. Her breath caught, visible in the cold. His eyes dropped to her mouth. He leaned in. It was a slow, inevitable movement. She did not pull away. She leaned toward him, her eyes closing. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the clean, cold scent of him. His lips were almost on hers. She could feel his breath. He stopped. He was trembling. It was not from cold. He pulled back, his jaw tight. He let go of her hand and looked into the fire, his whole body tense. "I won't," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I won't take what isn't offered freely. Not now. Not like this." The restraint was a physical thing in the room. It burned pleasantly, and it hurt at the same time. Mara felt a strange mix of relief and a sharp, aching disappointment. She pulled the blanket tighter. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was thanking him for, his respect or his refusal. Before he could answer, a heavy pounding came from downstairs. Not on their door, but on the front door of the boarding house. A loud voice echoed in the hall. "Mara Quinn, I know you're in there. Clinton Vale, I have business with you." Mara went rigid. Vale. Jack was on his feet in an instant. He pulled on his dry shirt, not bothering with the buttons, and buckled his gun belt. "Stay here," he said. "No, he's here for me." She grabbed her dress. It was still damp, but she pulled it on over her chemise, her hands shaking for a different reason now. Footsteps climbed the stairs. Grice was with him. "She's in here, Mr. Vale, with her husband." A sharp knock. "Mrs. Quinn." Jack opened the door. Clinton Vale was a tall, thin man, dressed in a black broadcloth suit that looked expensive and out of place in Hollow Bend. He had a pale, narrow face and eyes like polished stones. He looked past Jack, his gaze landing on Mara, who stood by the stove. "Mrs. Quinn, I am Clinton Vale. We have corresponded." "I know who you are," Mara said. Vale smiled, a thin, reptilian expression. He held up a folded piece of paper. "Then you know what this is. A note for $500, signed by your late husband. Liam Quinn, collateral, his share in the mine, which, as we both know, is now a hole in the ground." "It's worthless," Mara said. "The note is not. It is guaranteed by his assets, and as his widow, you are his sole asset." "I never signed that paper." "Your husband's mark is here," Vale said, tapping it. "Witnessed, perfectly legal. The debt is due. I am calling it in." "I have no money," Mara said, her voice hollow. "I am aware," Vale said. "I am, however, a reasonable man. I am prepared to forgive the debt in exchange for your cooperation." His eyes slid over her, lingering on the damp dress, the flush on her cheeks. Jack stepped forward, moving between Vale and Mara. "The lady said she has no money, and she said she didn't sign." Vale's eyes narrowed, shifting to Jack for the first time. "And you are?" "I'm her husband," Jack said. Vale laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You are not. I had you checked. You are John Smith, a drifter who arrived the same day she did. This pretense is pathetic." "Get out," Jack said. His voice was very, very quiet. "I will," Vale said, his smile widening. "But this paper remains. I am giving you 1 week, Mrs. Quinn, 7 days. Find $500, or find your way to my office. If you do neither, I will have the sheriff seize your possessions, such as they are, and have you thrown in the street for vagrancy. The law is the law." He placed the paper on the floor in the hallway, turned, and walked down the stairs. Grice scurrying after him. Mara sank onto the bed. 1 week, $500. It was an impossible sum. It was a death sentence. She looked at Jack, her eyes wide with a new, colder fear. "What am I going to do?" Jack stood at the door for a moment, listening to Vale leave. The sleet hammered the building. Lanty wanted him gone. Vale wanted her broken. He shut the door and bolted it. He turned to her, his face grim, his mind working. "We're leaving town," he said. "Leaving? Where? I have no money. He'll find me." "He won't find you where we're going. I need to check some winter feed at a line camp. Up on Coal Creek. It's remote. You'll be out of sight. It will give us time to think." "Coal Creek," she whispered. "The rustlers' camp?" "The one they're using," he said. "This one is mine. Or, it belongs to the man I work for. They won't look for you there." She hesitated. To leave town, to go with him, alone, into the wilderness. It was an enormous risk. It was stepping from one unknown into another. But then she looked at his face. This was the man who had stopped, his lips an inch from hers, because she had not offered. This was the man who had stood between her and Vale, who had taken the brunt of the storm. He was not pressing her. He was offering her a choice, a way out. She thought of Vale's cold eyes, and Grice's gold tooth, and the pinched faces of the women in the store. She stood up. "I'll get my bag." They rode out of Hallow Bend as the last light bled from the sky, leaving the snowfields awash in a deep, bruised purple. They did not use the main road, but cut north, following a frozen creek bed that Jack seemed to know by heart. The wind had dropped with the sun, and the air was so cold it felt sharp in the lungs. It carried new smells, not of coal smoke and whiskey, but of dry sage and the metallic bite of iron-rich rock. From the ridges above, coyotes yipped, their calls thin as nails, stitching the vast silence together. Mara rode a bay mare Jack had rented from the livery, her own small carpetbag tied behind the cantle. He rode the big roan, his rifle in its scabbard, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape. They rode in silence for nearly 2 hours, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of hooves on the frost-hardened earth. Just when Mara thought her legs would give out from the cold and the unaccustomed riding, Jack stopped. He pointed. "There!" At first, she saw nothing but a dip in the terrain. Then, tucked against the side of a bluff, she saw the low, dark shape of a cabin. It was barely a structure, more a dugout, with walls of sod and rock and a low, earth-covered roof. It was built for survival, not comfort. Jack dismounted in one fluid motion. "Wait here." He approached the cabin cautiously, his hand on his pistol. He checked the door, which was just planks, and then circled the small structure. He was checking for tracks, for any sign of recent use. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders relaxing a fraction. "It's clean," he said, taking the reins of her mare. He helped her down. Her legs were numb and stiff. She nearly fell. He steadied her, his grip firm on her elbow, holding her a second longer than necessary before letting go. Inside, the cabin was one small room, dark and smelling of dust and old ash. It was brutally simple. A small pot-bellied stove, a crude table, 2 stools, and a built-in bunk in the far wall heaped with old straw. Jack moved like a man at home, his actions quick and precise. He did not seem like a drifter now. He seemed like a man who owned the space he was in. He checked the stovepipe, laid a fire with kindling from a box he knew was by the door, and had a small, hot fire going in minutes. He took the horses to a small lean-to, brushed them down, and gave them a measure of feed from his saddlebag. He let them breathe the steam from their lungs, calming them, his hands gentle on their necks. When he returned, the cabin was already losing its deathly chill. Mara, feeling the need to be useful, had unpacked the small bag of provisions he'd bought: beans, coffee, bacon, flour. "I can cook," she said, her voice quiet. "I'd be obliged," he said. They fell into a simple, domestic rhythm. He took a bucket and broke ice at the creek for water. She mixed flour and water for biscuits and set the beans to boil. He found a broken hinge on the door latch and, using his knife and a piece of wire from his saddle tack, fixed it. The door now closed tight, shutting out the rising wind. Their chores were quiet and companionable. There was no need for the pretense of Hallow Bend. And in its absence, a different kind of connection formed, one built on the shared, simple tasks of staying alive. They ate sitting on the stools, the tin plates hot on their laps, the wind beginning to howl over the roof. After they ate, Jack cleaned the plates with snow, and Mara repacked the food. The small stove glowed red, casting a warm light. The wind was a living thing now, a high, lonely shriek that seemed to come from all directions. "That banker, Vale," Jack said, his voice low as he stared into the stove's grate. "He's connected to Lanty." "I know," Mara said, shivering, though not from cold. "They're a matched pair, the saloon and the bank, feeding on the same scraps." "They're feeding on more than scraps," Jack said. He looked at her, his face serious in the firelight. "You said your husband's mine. It's what he used for the note." "Yes, a small silver claim up in the Chokecherry Hills. Liam was always so sure it would make us rich. It never gave more than dust. When he died in the blast, the mine collapsed. There's nothing there. Vale knows it. The note is just, it's a tool to own me." The shame of it, the raw fear, made her voice thick. "He thinks because I am poor and alone, I am his for the taking. He thinks I am charity, or worse." "You're neither," Jack said, his voice flat. "I am terrified of being seen as charity," she whispered, the confession torn from her. "My first marriage, Liam, he wasn't a bad man, not at first, but he was weak, and he was lonely, even when I was in the room. He spent money we didn't have, trying to buy friends, and when the money was gone, he was cruel. Not with his fists. Worse, he'd ignore me for weeks. He'd make me feel like I was a stone he had to carry. When he died, I felt nothing, just cold, and then the shame came. The shame of the debts, the shame of being hungry, the shame of being grateful when the church ladies gave me scraps, and the shame of hating them for it." She hadn't meant to say so much. The words just poured out into the warm, safe quiet of the cabin. Jack listened. He did not interrupt. He just watched her, his gaze steady. When she was finished, her hands twisted in her lap. He looked away, back to the fire. "You mentioned snow," she said, needing to break the silence. "The trouble you had, was it bad?" He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Last winter, up on the Powder River. We were moving 300 head of breeding stock. A blizzard came up, a whiteout. Not just snow, but wind like a razor. You couldn't see the horns on the steer in front of you." He paused, the memory settling on him. "I was in charge. I had 4 men with me. Good men. I pushed them. I thought we could beat it. Get to the tree line. I thought I knew the land better than the storm." He poked the fire with a stick, the embers flaring. "I was wrong. We lost the herd, and I lost 2 men. Amos Coulter and a young fella named Pete. They froze. We found them 3 days later, not half a mile from a sheltered canyon. I led them right past it in the white." His voice was rough, hollowed out by guilt. "Their wages. I sent them to their families. But it don't fix it. A boss, a foreman. His first job is his men, not the cattle. I put the cattle first. I led them into that storm, and I'm the one who walked out." He turned to her, his eyes bleak. "So, yes, ma'am, it was bad." Now she understood the quiet, the weight he carried. His was a different kind of debt, but one that hounded him just as surely as hers. The wind hit the cabin with a physical, shuddering blow. Snow began to hiss against the single small window pane. "Storm's here," he said, and the words felt like a judgment. It was not a storm. It was a siege. For 2 days, the world vanished outside their door. The wind did not howl. It screamed, a constant, high-pitched, maddening sound. The snow came down not in flakes, but in horizontal sheets, burying the cabin, sealing them in. They kept the fire stoked, but the dry wood ran low. Jack braved the storm once, fighting his way to the lean-to to feed the horses and retrieve the last of the split logs. When he returned, he was covered in ice, his face raw, his beard and eyebrows frozen white. The cabin grew cold. The small space, which had seemed a shelter, became a cell. They rationed the food. They drank hot, weak coffee. They spoke little, their voices swallowed by the roar of the wind. On the second night, the temperature plummeted. The fire in the stove was a small, desperate circle of warmth in a sea of biting cold. The bunk, heaped with straw, was on the coldest wall. We can't sleep apart," Jack said, his voice rough. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the way her breath plumed in the air, even near the stove. "It's not safe. We'll freeze." He was right. She was already shivering so hard her teeth ached. "We'll use the pallet," he said. He pulled the straw-filled ticking from the bunk and dragged it as close to the stove as he dared. He piled their saddle blankets on it, and then the thin blanket from the bed in Hollow Bend. "It's the only way," he said. Mara nodded, her throat tight. He banked the stove, trying to make the last of the wood last till morning. He took off his boots and his gun belt. Placing the pistol close at hand, he lay down on the pallet, on the side closest to the door, his back to the wall. He kept his coat on. "Come on," he said. "Get under the blankets." She took off her wet boots, her fingers numb. She lay down beside him, her back to his, a stiff, cold line of terror and need between them. He pulled the top blanket over them, tucking it in around her shoulders. It's just for warmth," she whispered, as if saying it would make it true. "Just for warmth," he agreed, his voice a low rumble through his back. But the cold was relentless. It seeped through the floor, through the walls, through the blankets. After an hour, they were both shaking, their bodies rigid. "This ain't working," he muttered. He shifted. "Turn over." "What?" "Turn over. We have to share the heat, face to face, or back to front. It's the only way." She hesitated. "Mara," he said, her name a sharp plea in the dark. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. He turned, too. They were face to face, but the space between them was a gulf of ice. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and he moved, pulling her against his body. He was no longer John Quinn, the pretend husband, or Smith, the drifter. He was the man who had confessed his guilt into the fire. She pressed her frozen face into the rough wool of his coat, into the space at his shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight, his body a solid, warm wall against her. He tucked her head under his chin. One of her hands was trapped between their chests. She could feel his heart, a strong, steady beat beneath the layers of cloth. They lay like that. Every breath counted. The roar of the wind was their only chaperone. Desire, deep and slow, rose in the small space. It was not the desperate, fumbling passion of a saloon. It was the elemental need to be held, to be warm, to be safe. She felt his hand, the one at her back, move, his fingers splaying, not in a caress, but just holding. Her own hand on his chest, unclenched. She felt his chin rest on the top of her head. "Thank you," she whispered, the words muffled against his coat. His arm tightened. The thanks felt like a vow. They did not sleep, not really, but drifted in a shared cocoon of warmth, the storm raging outside, their bodies a silent promise against the cold. When the light changed, They knew the storm was easing. They lay still, stunned by the intimacy, by the profound safety of it. He moved first, his body stiff. "More wood," he murmured, as if waking from a dream. But neither of them moved. The hunger of the last 2 days, for food, for warmth, for connection, was a palpable thing. He pulled back just enough to see her face. Her hair was loose, her cheeks flushed. His eyes, no longer bleak, were dark with a different kind of need. "Mara," he said. He kissed her. It was not the near kiss of the room in Hallow Bend. This was an unhurried, careful exploration. It was a question, and she answered it, her cold lips softening under his. It was a kiss of gratitude, of shared survival, of a hunger that had nothing to do with food. It was not a rush. They were still bundled in their coats, their clothing a necessary barrier against the cold. But his hands found her face, his rough thumbs stroking her jaw. Her hands clutched the front of his coat, pulling him closer. The intimacy was about the trust they had built in the dark. It was about his confession and hers. It was about the way he had held her through the storm without demanding anything. When he finally broke the kiss, they lay with their foreheads touching, breathing the same air, stunned by how safe it had felt. "Jack," she whispered, using his name for the first time. He just held her, his heart pounding against hers. Come morning, the world was silent, muffled in white. The storm had broken. Jack rose first, his movement stiff. He rebuilt the fire, his face unreadable. The intimacy of the night hung in the air, fragile and new. "I'll check the horses," he said, pulling on his boots. He was gone for a long time. Mara tidied the cabin, her hands shaking. She felt different. She felt like she had finally, after years of cold, found a hand to hold in the dark. The door burst open. Jack stood there, his jaw hard. The man of the night before gone, replaced by the grim stranger. "What is it?" "Tracks, all around the cabin. They circled us. In the storm, rustlers, scouting." He grabbed his rifle. He went back outside, and Mara followed. He was building a fire, but not a small one. He added damp branches from under the lean-to, sending a thick, high column of white smoke into the still, blue air. "What are you doing?" "Sending a signal," he said, his eyes scanning the southern ridge. They waited. An hour passed. Mara's stomach was a cold knot. Had he just invited the men who were hunting them? Then she heard it. Hoofbeats, fast, 3 riders, pushing hard through the deep snow. They were not rustlers. They were cowboys, well-mounted, well-armed. They reined in at the cabin, their horses blowing steam. The leader, a man with a dark, sharp face and intelligent eyes, swung down, his gaze taking in the cabin, the smoke, and finally, Jack. "Boss," the man said, relief flooding his face. "We saw the smoke. After Lanty's warning, we thought. His eyes landed on Mara, standing in the doorway, and he stopped, his hat in his hand. The word hung in the frozen air. "Boss." Mara's blood went cold. She looked at the man, then at Jack. "Boss," she repeated, the word tasting like tin. The foreman, seeing the look on her face, blanched. "Ma'am, my apologies. Thomas Ortega, foreman of the Double Bar R." "Jack?" Mara's voice was a whisper. Jack closed his eyes for a second. The lie had come due. He turned to her, his face grim. "Mara, let me explain." "Explain what? Explain, boss?" "My name," he said, the words coming out hard. "It's not Smith. It's not Quinn. It's Jackson Ransom." Tomas and the other 2 hands looked away, suddenly very interested in their horses. "Jackson Ransom," she repeated. The name meant nothing. "Of the Double Bar R?" "I own it," he said, "and a quiet investor in some of the rail contracts." The blood drained from her face. She felt dizzy. A rich man, a cattleman, An investor. The man who had shared her pallet. The man who had kissed her. The man who had confessed his guilt. It was all a game.
You lied to me.
I hid my name, he corrected her, his voice tight. I had to. We've been losing cattle, not just to blizzards, to thieves. I came to Hallow Bend to get inside the supply chain, to find out who was selling my beef. Lanty, Vale, they're all part of it.
So you played at being poor,
she said, her voice brittle. The shame came rushing back, hot and acidic. You watched me, scrub floors? You let me beg you to pretend to be my husband?
Mara, it wasn't like that. When I met you...
You let me confess my shame to you. You let me tell you about Liam, about being hungry. While you were Jackson Ransom, she felt like the biggest fool in Wyoming territory. A poor woman, made a spectacle for a rich man's game. The intimacy they had shared. It felt dirty now. I didn't lie about the blizzard, he said, taking a step toward her. I didn't lie about the men I lost.
Stop,
she cried, backing away.
Don't touch me.
Her pride, the thing she had so carefully guarded, the thing she had finally let down, snapped back into place. It was a brittle, cold thing, and it was all she had. She turned and ran into the cabin. She grabbed her carpet bag, stuffing her few possessions into it. Mara, listen to me, he said, following her, his voice desperate. Thomas and his men were watching, their faces stiff with embarrassment.
Listen to what?
More lies? She pushed past him, out into the snow. She strode to the bay mare, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the reins. You can't ride back alone. It's not safe. The men who left those tracks, I would rather face them than spend one more minute with you. She spat, the words full of venom. You and your games. You wanted to see who profited from suffering? You should have just looked in a mirror. She mounted the horse, her movements clumsy with rage. Mara, he yelled, as she kicked the horse into a trot. She rode off, alone, heading back toward Hallow Bend. She did not look back. She kept her spine straight, her eyes fixed on the cold, flat line of the horizon, under a sky that had turned the color of tin. The rage was a fire in her belly, but it was a poor substitute for a coat. Mara kicked the bay mare, urging her through the snow, her back rigid with betrayal. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she was leaving him, leaving Jackson Ransom, the cattle king who played at being a drifter, the man who had held her, the man who had lied with every breath he took. The cold, which had been a threat, turned vicious. The wind rose, a high, keening shriek, lifting the new snow from the ground. It did not fall. It flew in horizontal sheets, a blinding, scouring white. The world disappeared. The trail she had been following, the faint tracks from their ride out, vanished under the ground-blown snow. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through her anger. She was lost. She reined in the mare, the horse turning its back to the wind, its head drooping. Mara pulled her collar tighter, but it was useless. The cold found every gap, every threadbare patch. She looked around, her eyes stinging, and saw nothing but a roiling, endless white. She had to go back. The thought was a shard of glass in her throat. To go back to him, to admit defeat, to see the pity in his eyes, or worse, the amusement. No, her pride, the brittle, icy thing that had been her only armor, would not allow it. Going back would break her. She would rather freeze. She saw a dark line to her right. The bluff, the edge of the creek bed. She had not lost the trail entirely. She turned the mare, her body aching, and pushed on. Her lips cracked, the sharp sting of blood immediate on her tongue. Her hands, in their thin gloves, went from aching to numb. She could no longer feel the reins. Behind her, at a distance, Jack followed. After she had ridden off, he had given sharp, clipped orders to his foreman. Thomas, take the men. Circle wide. North. Find their main camp. I want to know how many. Send word to Cheyenne. I want the territorial marshal here. No shooting unless you are shot at. I will handle Mrs. Quinn." Tomas had nodded, his face grim.
"Boss, she is not dressed for this."
"I know," Jack had said, his voice like gravel. He'd swung onto his roan. "I know." He kept her in sight, a small, dark figure against the white, a testament to stubborn pride. He gave her space. She needed to feel the cold. She needed to understand that the wildness she was fighting was not him, but the land itself. But his own ghosts rode with him. With every gust of wind that hid her from his view, his chest tightened. This was the blizzard all over again. This was the whiteout. This was the arrogance of a person thinking they could beat the storm. And he was, once again, the man following, helpless, watching it happen. I led them into that storm. Amos Coulter, young Pete. He saw their faces in the blowing snow. He had failed them. He would not fail her. He would not lose another soul to the white. If he lost her now, if her pride and his lie cost her life, the guilt would be a stone that finally, truly, drowned him. He urged the roan a little closer. Mara had been riding for hours. She was no longer angry. She was no longer anything. She was a single, frozen point of misery. Her body was a distant, aching thing. She was so cold. A strange, sleepy warmth was beginning to creep into her limbs. She knew what that meant. Then, through the haze, she saw it. Coal Creek, and the bridge, a flat, plank structure, a shortcut back to the main trail. It was a line of hope. She kicked the mare, her numb heels barely registering. The horse, sensing the end of the journey, moved faster. She did not see the ice. The bridge, exposed to the wind and the spray from the creek, was a sheet of black ice hidden under a treacherous dusting of snow. The mare's first hoof a quarter on its foot struck, and her legs went out from under her. The horse squealed, a sound of pure terror, fighting for purchase. It scrambled, slipped, and went down on its side. Mara was thrown. She was not a good enough rider to save herself. She flew from the saddle, landing not in the soft snow, but on the frozen, iron-hard bank. A crack and a searing, white-hot pain shot from her ankle up her leg. She screamed, but the wind tore the sound from her mouth. The horse, tangled in its own reins, scrambled to its feet and bolted, disappearing into the white. Mara lay on the bank, hugging herself against the wind, gasping. She tried to stand. The moment she put weight on her left foot, her leg collapsed. She cried out, a raw, guttural sound of pain and despair. She was alone. Her horse was gone. Her leg was broken. She was going to die here, on the bank of Coal Creek, because of her pride. "Mara!" His voice was a roar over the wind. The roan thundered to a stop, and he was off it before it even halted, plunging through the snowdrift toward her. "Mara!" He was kneeling beside her, his face a mask of fear. "Go away!" she spat, the words half a sob. She tried to scramble backward, away from him, the movement sending fresh agony up her leg. "Leave me alone! I told you, I'd rather freeze!" "You're getting your wish," he said, his voice rough. He reached for her, his gloved hand outstretched. "Take my hand." "No!" she cried, slapping at him, her blow weak. "Don't you touch me! You and your lies!" "Fine. Die here," he snarled, his face close to hers, his eyes burning. "Die because you're too stubborn to be helped. Is that what you want? Is your pride worth your foot?" She looked at him, her vision blurring, the tears freezing on her cheeks. She was shaking, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that rattled her bones. He was right. She was a fool. She looked at his hand. It was steady. She slowly, her teeth chattering, her entire body trembling with cold and pain and humiliation, reached out and took it. His grip was instant, strong, and warm. He did not pull her up. He shed his own heavy coat. the one he had wrapped her in before, and draped it over her. He worked with a desperate, focused energy. He unstrapped his saddle blanket and a length of rope. "I'm moving you. It will hurt." He did not wait for her permission. He slid his arms under her, one beneath her back, one under her knees, and lifted her. She cried out as her legs shifted. "I'm sorry," he grunted, carrying her. "I'm sorry." He carried her to a small bluff, a cut in the rock that offered a meager break from the wind. He set her down gently, her back against the stone, and covered her with his coat and the saddle blanket, fashioning a small lean-to. Then he set to work on the fire. It was a race against time. Her lips were blue. He had no dry wood. He pulled his knife and began hacking at the damp willow branches near the creek bed, stripping the bark, finding the drier wood within. His hands were sure, but the tinder was poor. He cursed, softly, a steady stream of invective against the wood, the wind, the ice. He struck a match. It flared and died. He struck another. It caught on a shred of bark, a tiny, struggling spark. He cupped it with his hands, blowing gently, feeding it slivers of wood as if it were a newborn animal. It smoked. It sputtered. He cursed again, his voice raw. Come on, you devil! Catch!" And finally, it did. A small, yellow flame licked the wood, caught, and grew. He added more sticks, his movements precise, until a small, crackling fire was blazing between them. The heat was a miracle. It hit her face, and the feeling was so intense, it was almost painful. The feeling came back to her hands and feet, a wave of stinging needles, and with the feeling came the rage, hot and clear. She was sitting by a fire, her leg broken, saved by the man who had destroyed her. "You enjoyed that, didn't you?" she said, her voice a harsh croak. He looked up from the fire, his face blackened with soot and raw from the wind. "Enjoyed what?" "Saving me. The rich cattle baron, Jackson Ransom, saving the poor, stupid widow from the storm. It must have been a fine ending to your game." "This was never a game," he said, his voice low, his eyes on the fire. I didn't plan you, Mara." "You played at poverty," she accused, her voice rising. "You let me think you were a drifter. You watched me scrub floors at the laundry. You watched me count pennies for a bar of soap. You watched me. You let me confess. Also, you could have your little adventure. So you could see, as you said, who profited from suffering." "Yes," he said, his head snapping up, his eyes blazing. "Yes, that's exactly why. Do you think I can do that from a ranch house in Cheyenne? Do you think I can learn the truth from a desk? I needed to see the rot for myself. I needed to smell the dust and the fear. I needed to know who was buying my stolen cattle and who was using that money to break people. Men like Vale, men like Lanty. They don't just steal livestock, Mara, they steal lives. They were stealing yours. And you were just going to step in and save me, the king in disguise." "I wasn't going to save you. I was there, and then you were there. It wasn't part of the plan." "That night," she whispered, the shame hot. "In the cabin, during the storm. Was that part of the plan? Was that just you seeing the rot?" He flinched, as if she had struck him. He stood up and turned his back to her, staring out into the blowing snow. "That," he said, his voice thick, "was the only truth in any of it." He turned back, his face ravaged. "Don't you understand? I am terrified of that. I'm the man who leads other men into blizzards. I'm the man who gets them killed. I'm good at cattle. I'm good at land. I'm good at numbers. I am no good at this, at you." He knelt in front of her, his hands clenched. "I wanted you, from the moment I saw you in that cafe, counting your coins, your pride a thing I could almost touch. And it frightened me. And when we, in that cabin, that was more real than my name, or my money, or any of it. and I am terrified of it." The confession hung in the air between them, as raw as her ankle, as hot as the fire. She stared at him, the tears freezing in her lashes. I wanted you too," she admitted, the words tasting like blood and ash. "I wanted you, the drifter, the man with nothing, and I hated myself for it. I thought I was just the poor widow, falling for the first kind word. And then to find out you were a king, it made me a fool you played with." "I am no king," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm just a man with too many ghosts and a conscience that won't let me sleep. And I want you, Mara Quinn, in a way that frightens me to death." The argument burned itself out, leaving an exhausted, aching silence. The fire crackled, the wind howled, but it felt farther away. He looked at her leg, his expression turning practical. "We need to set that. It's not broken. I don't think. A bad sprain. But you can't ride. My horse is gone. We'll take mine, but not back to the camp." He sat back on his heels. "I am not offering you money. Mara, I won't insult you with it." "Then what?" she asked, her voice small. "Proof." He reached inside his shirt, pulling out a small, oilskin-wrapped packet. He'd kept it on him, even in the storm. "I am who I am. I can't change that, but I can use it. This is why I came." He undid the packet. Inside were ledgers, bills of sale, brand inspection receipts from a crooked inspector at the railhead. "This," he said, his finger tapping a line, "is your banker, Clinton Vale, arranging payment to a holding company for feed. This," he tapped another, "is Red Lanty, signing off on a bill of lading for 30 head of cattle. My brands, altered with a running iron. This ties them together. This ties them to the rustlers. And this," he pulled out a final, folded paper. "This is a copy of a note, just like yours, from a widow in Laramie. Vale bought it for 10 cents on the dollar, and then he used it to take her boarding house. He's done it 5 times that I know of." He looked up at her, his steel gray eyes clear. "I am not offering you charity. I am offering you justice. I am offering you a way to burn them down with the truth. But I cannot do it without you. You are the face of his crimes." She looked at the papers, then at his face, illuminated by the fire. He was not playing. This was his blizzard, his fight. He wasn't offering to save her. He was offering to fight with her. She was tired of being a victim. She was tired of being cold. She nodded. "Once." "All right, Mr. Ransom. We'll burn them down." The ride back was an agony. He had to lift her onto the roan, and then mount behind her, pulling her back against his chest. She had to ride with her legs stiff, the pain shooting up her side with every step. But he was a solid, warm wall behind her, his arm a steady bar around her waist. And the wind, for the first time, could not touch her. They rode into Hollow Bend at dawn, 2 figures on 1 horse, their faces raw with wind, their clothes covered in soot and ice. The town looked different, the same false fronts, the same dusty street. But she was not the same woman who had arrived here. She was not alone. They rode shoulder to shoulder, or as close as they could, and dismounted in front of the livery. Jack lifted her down, his hands gentle, and did not let her go. He half carried her, her arm around his neck, down the boardwalk. He did not take her to the Drover's Rest. He took her to the small, white church. The basement door was open. The ladies were gathering for their quilting circle. They staggered in, Jack supporting her. The schoolmarm, Mrs. Davies, and the 2 laundresses from Mrs. Gables looked up from their coffee, their faces, once pinched and cold, changed. Town gossip was one thing. This was another. They saw a woman on the edge of collapse, her face bruised by the cold, her leg useless. They saw the pain. "Good Lord, child," Mrs. Gable said, dropping her sewing. She was at Mara's side in an instant.
What happened to you?
She fell, Jack said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Her ankle. The prejudice, the judgment. It all thinned like smoke. They saw a woman who had suffered, and their shared experience of hardship, the true currency of the West, took over.
Bring her here. Mrs., Davies ordered, pointing to a cot.
They brought hot coffee and a dry, warm shawl. They unwrapped her foot, clucking with sympathy at the swollen, purple ankle. They brought a basin of hot water and laudanum for the pain. They did not ask about Jackson Ransom. They did not ask about the lie. They simply tended to her. Jack watched for a moment, his face grim. "I will be back," he said to Mara. She nodded, her eyes full. He walked out, his long-legged, purposeful stride. He went first to the telegraph office, sending 2 long wires, one to Cheyenne, one to his bank. Then he went to the hotel. Judge Henry Norris, the circuit judge, was a hard man who hated corruption. He was in his room, having breakfast, when Jack was shown in. Jack laid the oilskin packet on the table. "Judge, my name is Jackson Ransom, and I have proof that Clinton Vale and Red Lanty are gutting this territory." The judge listened, his eyes never leaving Jack's face as he laid out the ledgers, the receipts, the forged notes. "It's a tight case, Mr. Ransom," the judge said, sipping his coffee. "We'll set a hearing. I'm due in court this morning. We can act then." "Thank you, Judge." "Justice, Mr. Ransom. It's all we have out here." Jack walked out of the hotel, the plan set. As he stepped onto the boardwalk, he saw a town deputy tacking a paper to the front door of the Drover's Rest, right where Mara and he had first stood. Jack walked over and read it. It was a legal notice of eviction for Mara Quinn, for failure to pay the debt to Clinton Vale. The eviction was timed for 10 o'clock that very morning. Vale had just set his own trap. Jack checked his pocket watch. It was 9:15. The notice of eviction was a declaration of war, tacked to the door of the Drover's Rest. It gave Mara Quinn until 10 o'clock. It was 9:15. Jack tore the paper from the wood. He moved, his long strides purposeful. He found Judge Norris in the courthouse, a small, cold room that smelled of dust and old ink. "They set the trap for 10, Jack said, slapping the paper on the desk. "But they set it on your day. Judge." Judge Norris read the paper, his lips a thin, hard line. "A legal eviction, Mr. Ransom, based on a legal note of debt. A forged note, a fraudulent debt, part of a conspiracy I can prove." "Then you must prove it," the judge said. "I cannot stop a legal proceeding on a man's word, not even yours, but I can delay it. I will grant a temporary stay, pending a review of the debt's validity. That gives you until tonight, not a minute more. My court is informal. Bring me your proof and your accusers in one room, and I will bring the law." "One room," Jack said. "I know the one." The trap was reset, this time by Jack. He found Tomas, who had been watching the church basement from a distance. "The wire to Cheyenne," Jack ordered. "I want confirmation on Vale's purchase of widow notes, everything. And I want the territorial marshal, but tell him to come quiet. Thomas, I need you back here before sundown, with everything you can find from the feed store, ledgers, receipts, anything with a brand on it." Thomas nodded, his face grim. "He will be there, boss. Vale." "I'm counting on it," Jack said. He handed Tomas a sheaf of telegram requests. "And Tomas, send for 2 of my men from the North Camp, men who can handle themselves, quiet. Have them at the alley behind the Golden Spur Saloon. Tonight, 9 o'clock, no one in, no one out, unless I say—" Tomas was gone, his horse kicking up slush. Now, Jack had to lay the bait. He walked not to the saloon, but to the livery. It was the town's nerve center, a place where news traveled faster than a telegraph wire. He found the hostler, Silas, the same man who had been so free with information before. Jack was no longer Smith, the drifter. He was Jackson Ransom, owner of the Double Bar R. He walked in, and the stable went quiet.
Mr. Ransom, sir,
Silas said, his eyes wide, dropping his curry comb. Silas, Jack said, his voice loud enough to carry. He tossed a silver dollar onto a hay bale. I need a bath, a shave, and the best steak in town. And I need to find Red Lanty. I hear he's a man who can get things done. Sir, he's at the saloon. Always. Good, Jack said. He turned, as if an afterthought. I also need to find that banker. Vale. It seems he's been troubling a friend of mine, a Mrs. Quinn. He claims she owes him money. He laughed, a cold, humorless sound. $500? I've lost more than that in a poker game. Silas's eyes were plates. He served her papers this morning. Mr. Ransom, eviction. Did he now? Jack's voice was dangerously mild. Well, that won't do. A man can't have his friends tossed in the street. It's bad for a town's reputation. You tell anyone who asks, I'm settling it. Tonight. I'm paying the poor woman's debt. In full cash. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble that he knew would be repeated verbatim. But I'm not doing it in some dusty office. I'll do it at Lanty's saloon, 9 o'clock, where everyone can see. I want witnesses. I want that note, and I want it burned. And then, I'm buying a round for the entire town. He walked out, leaving the silver dollar and the stunned hostler behind. The news would be all over Hallow Bend in an hour. Vale would hear it. Lanty would hear it. They would smell money and a public victory, and they would be there. They were greedy men, but more than that, they were proud. They would not miss the chance to see Jackson Ransom pay them, in their own place of power. Jack went to the church basement. The women had bandaged Mara's ankle. It was badly sprained, purple and swollen, but not broken. She was sitting up, sipping coffee, her face pale but her eyes clear. He knelt in front of her. The other women faded back, giving them space. It's set, he said, his voice low. What is? The end of it. Tonight, at Lanty's saloon, I'm going to pay your debt. Her head snapped up, the old, brittle pride flaring. You are not. I told you. I will not take your money. I will not be your charity. It's not my money, he said, his hand closing over hers. Her skin was warm. It's bait. I'm using my name and my reputation to get them in a room with the judge. I'm going to count out the coin, and before the last dollar drops, the trap springs. She looked at his hand on hers. And me? I need you there, he said, his voice rough. I need them to see you. I need the town to see you. This is not just about ledgers. Mara, it's about them seeing who they did this to. She looked at her bandaged foot. I can't walk in there. Jack, not like that. They'll see me as a broken thing. He stood up, pulling her gently with him. He slid his arm around her waist, and she put her arm around his neck, the way they had on the horse. He took her weight. Then I will carry you, he said. We walk in together, shoulder to shoulder, or this way. But we walk in. She looked into his eyes, the steel-gray promise of them. I can walk, she said, her chin high. I'll lean on you, but I will walk. That night, the sleet returned, lashing the windows of the Golden Spur. The saloon was packed. Jack's promise of a $500 payment and a free round had drawn every drifter, cowboy, and merchant in Hallow Bend. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and anticipation. Red Lanty was behind his bar, polished to a shine, a smirk on his florid face. He was the king in his castle, and the richest man in the territory was coming to pay him tribute. At 9:05, the bat-wing door swung open. A hush fell over the room. It was not a silence, It was a cessation of sound, a vacuum. Jackson Ransom stood in the doorway. He was clean-shaven, wearing a fine black coat and a clean shirt. He looked every inch the cattle baron. At his side, her hand gripping his arm, her face pale but her eyes burning, was the widow, Mara Quinn. She was not dressed in finery. She wore her same threadbare wool dress, but she was clean. Her hair was brushed, and she kept her chin high. She limped badly, but she did not falter, her weight supported by the man beside her. They walked, step by painful step, through the crowd. The men parted for them like the Red Sea. They did not look like a man saving a victim. They looked like a pair united, walking into a fight. They stopped at the bar. "Lanty," Jack said, his voice carrying easily over the quiet room. "Mr. Ransom," Lanty said, his smile wide, showing his gold tooth. "A pleasure to have you. And the lovely Mrs. Quinn, what can I get for you?" "You can get the note," Jack said. Lanty's smile faltered for a second. He looked over the crowd, and his smile returned. "Of course, business first." A man stepped from the back office. It was Clinton Vale, his black suit immaculate, his eyes cold and triumphant. He held a piece of paper. Beside him was a thick-necked man wearing a town-issued bailiff's star. A bought man. "Mr. Ransom," Vale said, his voice a dry sneer. "How generous of you to take an interest in the less fortunate Mrs. Quinn. You do find the most interesting protectors." Mara's hand tightened on Jack's arm. He put his own hand over hers. "The note, Vale," Jack said. "And the price? Let's have it, in front of witnesses." "Witnesses?" Vale laughed. "The whole town is witness. The price is $500, as agreed. The debt of her late husband. A legal, binding document." "I'm sure it is," Jack said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and upended it on the bar. A cascade of gold and silver coins, double eagles and dollars, spilled onto the wood. The room sighed, a collective breath of awe. "I like to pay in cash," Jack said. He began to count. Slowly, deliberately. He stacked the coins. 100. He stacked more. 200. Vale watched, his eyes gleaming, his hand reaching for the paper. Lanty poured himself a whiskey, his gaze fixed on the gold. 300. 400. Jack's hand moved slowly, pushing coins into the last stack. 450, 470, 490. He picked up a single silver dollar. His hand hovered over the stack. The room held its breath. Vale leaned in, ready to snatch the money. Jack stopped. He looked up, not at Vale, but at the saloon doors. "It's a lot of money. Vale, for a note you bought for, what was it, $5? 10? Vale's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Jack said. "Judge Norris, I believe we have some evidence to discuss." The batwing doors swung open again. Judge Norris walked in, his face like thunder. Beside him was the real deputy, a grizzled man named Hatcher, his hand resting on his pistol. "What is the meaning of this?" Lanty blustered from behind the bar. "This is a private transaction." "It is now a public hearing," the judge said, his voice cutting through the smoke. "And this saloon is now my courtroom." Panic flashed in Vale's eyes. He looked at the bought bailiff, who was suddenly looking at his own boots. "Mr. Ransom," the judge said, "you claim to have evidence?" "I do," Jack said. The doors opened again. Thomas Ortega stepped in. He was covered in mud, but he carried 2 leather-bound ledgers. "Tomas," Jack said, "what did you find?" "This, boss," Tomas said, throwing the first ledger onto the bar. It opened to a page of figures. "The feed store ledger, Hallow Bend, Lanty here, he pointed, was buying feed for 300 head of cattle, but he was shipping beef for 500. The extra 200? They matched the brands from the double bar R, altered, right here. He pointed to a smeared, inked brand.
Lies!
Lanty shouted, his face purple. And this, Tomas said, pulling a sheaf of telegrams from his coat. From the Cheyenne Telegraph. A wire from Mr. Vale's bank confirming the purchase of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 widow's notes, all purchased for less than 10 cents on the dollar, all foreclosed on within a month, including a Mrs. Abigail Sims in Laramie and a Mrs. Mara Quinn in Hallow Bend. The judge's brows rose. He looked at Vale. Threatening to collect at face value for a debt you bought for pennies. Mr. Vale, that is more than shrewd business. That is predatory fraud. Vale saw it all collapse. His reputation, his bank, his freedom. He did not look at the judge. He looked at the papers, the ledgers, the telegrams, the evidence. He lunged. He clawed for the papers on the bar, a wild animal sound in his throat. Burn it! Burn it all! At the same instant, Lanty's hired gun, the thin man in black, moved. He wasn't reaching for a ledger. He was reaching for his pistol. A shot cracked, deafening in the enclosed space. Glass exploded. The big mirror behind the bar went to glitter, showering Lanty in shards. Panic. The room stampeded. Men roared, cursed, and dived for the doors. A table flipped, sending cards and chips flying. A kerosene lamp shattered, and a small river of fire ran across the floor before someone smothered it with a coat. Sleet and wind hissed through the broken window. In the second, the shot was fired. Jack did not draw. He moved. He spun, grabbing Mara, pulling her off her feet and shielding her with his own body, pushing them both down behind the heavy oak bar. "Stay down!" he yelled. He came up, his pistol in his hand. He had not drawn with the speed of a gunfighter, but with the deadly, economical steadiness of a man who hates the need. Vale was on the floor, scrambling for the scattered telegrams. Lanty's hired gun was leveling his pistol for another shot, this time at the judge. Jack's gun fired once. The hired gun's pistol clattered to the floor, his hand grabbing his shattered wrist, his face a mask of white-hot pain. "Deputy!" Judge Norris roared. The bought bailiff was already halfway out the door. Deputy Hatcher was not. He had his pistol on Lanty, who had his hands in the air, his gold tooth a stark circle in his terrified, pale face. "It's over," Jack said, his voice calm in the sudden, echoing quiet. Vale was on his knees, clutching the papers, sobbing. "Clinton Vale, Red Lanty," the judge said, his voice shaking with cold fury. "You are under arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and cattle theft. Deputy, take them." Hatcher moved in, cuffing Vale, who offered no resistance. "And you," he said, grabbing the hired gun. Lanty looked at Jack, his eyes full of hate. You have no idea what you've done." "I have a very good idea," Jack said. He holstered his pistol and turned, kneeling behind the bar. Mara was huddled, her eyes wide, but she was not crying. She was watching. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands checking her, his voice frantic. "No," she whispered. "No, I'm not." He helped her up. She leaned on him, and they walked out from behind the bar. The saloon was a wreck. The patrons who remained were silent, watching. "Mrs. Quinn," Judge Norris said, his voice gentle. "Your eviction is stayed. This note," he picked up the forged paper, "is confiscated as evidence. Justice." It had come not like a sunrise, but like a lightning strike, violent, sudden, and cleansing. Jack helped her toward the door. The sleet was meaner now, cutting through the night. The town looked dark. The street empty. They were in the alley, the church basement just 100 yards away, when Tomas ran to join them.
Boss, the men are at the back. They caught one of Lanty's men trying to slip out with a cash box.
Good, Jack said. Get it to the deputy. A flash from the darkness. From the end of the alley, a man who had escaped the saloon, a rustler, fired from the dark. It was not an aimed shot. It was a panic shot. "Jack!" Mara screamed. Thomas cried out, a sharp grunt of pain, and stumbled, grabbing his arm. Jack returned fire, 2 quick shots into the blackness. They heard the sound of boots pounding, and then silence. The man was gone. "Tomas!" Jack was at his side.
"It's my shoulder. Boss, it just stings."
Thomas was bleeding, a dark stain spreading through his coat. Mara, who had been leaning on Jack, pushed away from him. She limped to Thomas, her face set. "Sit down, right here." She tore a long strip from her own petticoat, her hands, which had been shaking. Suddenly sure, she unbuttoned Thomas's shirt, her touch gentle but firm, exposing the wound. It was a grazing wound, ugly, but the bullet had passed through.
"It's clean,"
she said, her voice low and steady.
"Hold this. Press hard. Jack, give me your handkerchief."
She worked, her hands sure despite the shaking, her face illuminated by the light from the saloon. Jack watched her, his face a mixture of awe and fear. They made their way to the courthouse, Thomas leaning on Jack, Jack supporting Mara. They gave their statements to the judge. The courthouse was quiet, the storm rattling the windows. "A formal hearing is scheduled for the spring circuit," the judge said, signing a paper. "Vale and Lanty will be held in Cheyenne. Their assets are frozen, and the forged debts, Mrs. Quinn, are void. It is over." He looked at Mara, his eyes kind. "You are a woman of remarkable courage." He then looked at Jack. "Mr. Ransom, Hallow Bend owes you a debt, but there is a power vacuum now. Keep the peace. I suspect this is not the last shot we will hear." They stepped back out into the sleet. The town was dark, but it felt different. The air was cleaner. A few townspeople watched from their windows as Jack Ransom half-carried, half-walked the widow Mara Quinn down the boardwalk. They were no longer a spectacle. They were a new kind of couple, forged in secrets and violence, walking shoulder to shoulder into whatever came next. Winter settled on Hallow Bend not like a blanket, but like a steel trap. The wind did not howl. It scoured. The snow did not drift. It buried. The world shrank to the space between the stove and the wall. In the church basement, where Mara's ankle was slowly mending, Jack Ransom sat on a low stool. The scent of coffee and old wool filled the air. He had not returned to his ranch. He had stayed. His presence a quiet, steadying force in the town. He'd had his men, Thomas included, secure the line camps and bring order back to the chaos Lanty and Vale had left. He waited until Mrs. Davies and the other women were gone, leaving only the 2 of them in the lamplight. He did not pace. He just looked at her, his hands resting on his knees. "The judge says the spring thaw is when the final papers will be signed," he said. "But it's done. Vale and Lanty are gone." "I know," she said, her hands folded in her lap. "The question is, what's next? Mara." She waited. She would not let herself hope. "I am returning to the Double Bar R. It's a 3-day ride from here. My men are there. The work is there." He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man walking on thin ice. "I am not offering you a place to hide, and I am not offering you charity. I am offering you a choice." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. It was not a note. It was a contract. "I need a bookkeeper. The man I had was good with cattle, but a fool with numbers. I suspect he was in Lanty's pocket. The work is to keep the ledgers, tally the feed, the wages, the calf counts against the brand reports. It's hard work. It's honest work." He laid the paper on the cot between them. "It pays $40 a month. And a room." The foreman's old cabin is empty. It's separate from the main house. It's warm. You would be your own woman, on your own terms. Until spring, at least, or longer, if it suits you. She looked at the paper, then at his face.
A contract.
A contract, he affirmed. An obligation I have to you, and you have to me. Nothing more, unless you wish it. He looked her straight in the eye, and his own were bleak with honesty. And time for you to see who I am, when I'm not hiding. Time for you to decide. No more lies. Mara, not ever. She looked at the strong, simple script. He was not offering to save her. He was offering her a job. He was offering her the one thing no one else ever had, respect. She read the paper. She saw the wage, the terms. She saw the signature at the bottom, Jackson Ransom. I have a condition, she said. He tensed. Name it. I will take the work, but not the foreman's cabin. I won't live in your shadow. I will live in the bunkhouse, with the hands. He frowned. Mara, the bunkhouse. It's rough. It's not for a lady. I am not a lady. I am a bookkeeper, she said, her voice hard. I will not be the source of gossip. I will not be the boss's woman. I will be an employee, and I want a room with a lock I control. He looked at her for a long, measuring moment. He saw the iron in her spine. He was not just offering her a choice. He was seeing her make one. He nodded. Once. All right. The old bunkhouse by the creek. It's small, but it's solid. I'll have Tomas clean it out. A lock you control. He stood up. We ride when your ankle is fit. It's fit now, she said, planting her foot on the floor. She winced, but she stood. She took the work. The Double Bar R was not a ranch. It was a kingdom, sprawling over a valley so wide it took a day to ride across it. The main house was built of thick pine logs, a fortress against the wind. The bunkhouses, the barns, the corrals were a small town unto themselves. Tomas, his arm in a sling but his grin intact, had done as instructed. The small, abandoned line bunkhouse was spotless. It was one room, like the cabin, but it was clean, had a good stove, a sturdy bed, and a brand new brass lock on the door. Mara moved in, and she went to work. The ranch office was a mess of receipts, ledgers, and scribbled notes. She spent the first week just sorting, her mind sharp, her hand steady. She learned the brands. She learned the names of the men. She learned the language of cattle, of feed, of winter losses and spring hopes. The hands watched her. They were wary. They had seen women on the ranch before, but they were wives, or cooks, or the other kind. Never a woman who sat in the boss's office. A woman who had come to town as a widow and left at the boss's side. Respect, she knew, was not given. It was earned. It happened in the third week. A foreman named Peters, who ran the north pasture, came in, his hat in his hand, his face red with frustration. Ma'am, Mrs. Quinn, he said, twisting his hat. The feed tallies. They're wrong. The boss is going to have my hide. It says I'm short 500 pounds of winter cake. I ain't. I swear I ain't. Mara looked at his tally sheet. A mess of pencil marks. Then she looked at the main ledger. She ran the numbers, her finger moving down the column. She found it. A simple mistake in addition. The main ledger, the one the old bookkeeper had kept, was wrong. Peters was right. She did not smile. She did not point out his poor arithmetic. She simply took her pen, made the correction in the main ledger, and initialed it. The main ledger was in error. Mr. Peters, she said, her voice quiet. Your tally is correct. I've fixed it. The accounts are balanced. He stared at her, his mouth open. She had not shamed him. She had not run to the boss. She had simply, quietly, fixed it. I'm obliged, ma'am, he stammered. It's my job, Mr. Peters, to make sure the numbers are true. He left the office, walking a little straighter. The word spread through the ranch like a grass fire. The new bookkeeper, she was smart, but more, she was square, she was fair. The respect began to grow, quiet and tough as frost-hardened grass. Even the town of Hallow Bend felt the shift. When Mara had to ride in for supplies, a trip she made alone. The air was different. The clerk at the mercantile, the one who had shortchanged her, now jumped to serve her. He called her Mrs. Quinn and counted her change back twice into her palm.
The church ladies, Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Davies, brought her a small parcel. It was mending. Yes, but it was not her mending. It was shirts for the ranch hands. They were asking her to distribute it. They were treating her not as a charity case, but as a matron, a woman of standing. Prejudice doesn't vanish. It just has less air to breathe. The whispers about the widow and the cattle king died down. They were replaced by a new, grudging respect. She was Mrs. Quinn, the bookkeeper of the Double Bar R, and she had earned the name. The winter held. The work was hard. The days short. Mara ate her meals in the main house, at the long table with Jack and his foreman. They talked of cattle, of snow depth, of the price of beef in Chicago. She listened, and she learned. And when they talked of numbers, she spoke, her voice clear, and the men listened to her. Jack kept his promise. He was the boss. He was kind, but distant. He gave her work, and he gave her space. He never came to her bunkhouse after dark. He never touched her hand. He treated her exactly as he had promised, as an employee, and it was driving her mad. The cold, the distance, it was worse than the blizzard. She had known his touch. She had known the safety of his arms. This polite, respectful stranger was harder to bear than the liar had been. She saw him ride out, his shoulders broad against the snow, and her heart ached with a loneliness that was sharp and specific. One night, the wind stopped. The silence was as profound as the storm had been. The world was frozen, still. Mara stepped out of her bunkhouse, her breath a cloud of white. The sky was not black. It was alive. Faint veils of green and pale violet light rippled across the stars. The aurora. She walked, drawn by the silence, her feet crunching on the packed snow. She walked toward the fence line, toward the vast, open pasture. A figure was already there, leaning against the top rail, watching the sky. Jack. She stopped, her hand at her throat. She should turn back. It's cold, he said, his voice quiet, not turning. But it's beautiful. She walked slowly and stood beside him, not touching, but close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. They stood for a long time, side by side, their shoulders almost brushing, and watched the heavens dance. The words were unnecessary. The quiet was a living thing, the same quiet they had shared in the line camp, a quiet built of shared danger and unspoken need. He spoke first, his voice a low rumble. Mara. She looked at him. His face was profiled against the strange, green light. He looked tired. I am a rich man, he said, his voice plain. I own this land. I own the cattle. I have a house in Cheyenne. I cannot change that. It is who I am. He turned to face her. And I am a liar. I lied to you. I hid who I was, and I let you be vulnerable in front of me. I won't make excuses for it. It was wrong, and I'm asking you to forgive me for it. She looked at his hands, gripping the top rail. Quiet hands, strong hands, the hands that had built a fire and fought for her and held her. I almost froze to death. Jack, she whispered, her own confession. On the bank of that creek. Not because of the cold, but because of my pride. I mistook it for armor. I thought it was all I had left. It was just a brittle, stupid thing. And it almost killed me. She met his gaze, the tears freezing as they formed. When you lied to me, it wasn't the lie that hurt. It was that the
The man I was starting to feel for was a ghost. He was a drifter named John, and I was ashamed of wanting him. "And now?" he asked, his voice thick. "Now I see the real man. You are not a king. Jack, you are just, you're stubborn. You're tender. You carry the weight of the men you lost like a cross. You hate bullies. And you have quiet hands." She reached out, her mitten brushing his hand on the rail. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice finally clear and strong. "I don't want your brand. I want you." He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since Hallow Bend. He covered her hand with his. "I want a life with you, Mara, but only if you want it, too, freely, with your eyes open." "My eyes are open," she said. He did not kiss her, not then. He just held her hand, and they stood under the silent, shifting lights, two small figures in a vast, cold world. Finally, warm. They married at sunrise. There was no church, no fine dress. They stood beside the frozen creek, under the bare, black arms of the cottonwoods. The rising sun struck the snow and set the world on fire with a cold, pink light. Judge Norris came up from Hallow Bend, his buggy the only sound in the dawn. He signed the papers on the flat of a saddle. Tomas stood as Jack's witness, his grin so wide it looked like it hurt. Mara's witnesses were the women from the Hallow Bend laundry, Mrs. Gable and Mrs. Davies. They had ridden out the day before, bringing a small, lopsided cake. They stood, their faces red from the cold, and wept silently. The vows were short and firm. They were not promises of ease. They were promises of partnership. When it was done, Jack turned to her. He did not call her Mrs. Ransom. He just looked at her, his eyes full. He lifted her gloved hand and kissed her knuckles. Tomas let out a whoop. The laundry women tied scraps of colored ribbon, saved from sewing, onto the bare branches of the cottonwoods, where they fluttered in the sharp, clean air. Their wedding night was not in the grand main house. It was in the foreman's cabin, the one he had first offered her, the one she had refused. Now she entered it as his wife. He had built a fire. The small cabin was warm. On the table, someone, Tomas probably, had left a loaf of fresh bread, still warm, and a jar of preserves. A new, clean quilt, in a bright star pattern, was folded on the bed. And the door had a new, simple latch. She stood in the center of the room, her coat still on. He stood by the door, his hat in his hands. The air was thick with all the things they had not said, all the ways they had not touched. He bolted the door. The sound was a simple, final click. They were alone, safe. The world was shut out. "Mara," he said, his voice rough. She turned to him. And the desire, pent and patient, the desire that had been simmering since the line camp, unfolded. It was not a rush. It was a reverence. He took her coat, his movements slow. She unpinned her hat. They learned each other in the firelight. He spoke her name like a prayer, a question, and she answered with his. There was heat, a deep, slow-building fire that had been banked for too long. But there was tenderness, too. They stopped when breath needed catching, when the emotion was too much. There was laughter, surprised and sudden, at the clumsiness of buttons. There were tears, of release, of gratitude, of an end to the long, cold loneliness. They came together not as a king and a widow, but as a man and a woman who had seen the worst of each other and had chosen. Anyway, spring came like a bell. The thaw was sudden. The creek ice broke with a sharp crack, a sound like a church bell ringing across the valley. The world, locked in white, turned to brown mud and then, overnight, to a startling, hopeful green. The bawling of new calves was the only sound. With the thaw came the final word from Cheyenne. Judge Norris's ruling was absolute. Clinton Vale was bound for the territorial prison, sentenced to 10 years for fraud and conspiracy. Red Lanty. His saloon and assets seized, was fined and banished from the territory. Mara's forged debts were declared void. The paper they were written on, burned. The past was finally, legally, dead. They rode the high pasture that summer, their horses moving side by side. The storm still came, rolling in black and purple over the mountains. Hard choices still had to be made. When to sell, when to hold, who to hire, who to fire. Life was not easy. But their house, the small cabin they had never left, stood tight against the wind. Mara's ledgers were balanced. Jack's cattle were healthy. They sat on the porch at dusk, their shoulders brushing, their hands laced together, watching the sky. It was no longer pewter, no longer tin. Love was no longer a disguise, no longer a pretense or a game. It was the work they did, shoulder to shoulder. It was the food they shared, the fences they mended, the quiet they kept. They had learned to ask for warmth without shame, under a sky that finally, after a long and brutal winter, looked like mercy. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I truly hope you enjoyed it. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment and let us know. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories just like this one. And finally, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Mara and Jack's journey, so please share your comments in English.